He said it plain, the way he said everything. The town said you were too independent to marry. Nobody told me that was a problem. She did not answer him at first. She only set the coffee pot down on the stove with the same steady hand she had used to set down every other hard thing in her life, and she looked at him across a kitchen that had, until that November afternoon in 1887, belonged only to her. Clara Bennett was 34 years old. She was 5'6", with brown hair she wound into a low knot at the nape of her neck, gray eyes the color of creek water in late winter, and the kind of straight-backed posture a woman earns from years of lifting hay bales and children who were not her own. She wore a high-collared blue wool dress that reached her wrists and her boots, a wool shawl the color of oatmeal, and a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother. She had lived alone on 160 acres of hill pasture 2 miles west of Durango, Colorado, for 6 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She had counted the first year. She had stopped counting the second. The counting had come back, quietly, after the third winter, the way old habits do. The town of Durango, in the year 1887, was 700 souls of mostly good people who had made up their minds about her early. Clara Bennett ran her own place. Clara Bennett paid her own accounts down at Halloran's Mercantile on the 1st of every month. Clara Bennett had turned down, by the mercantile keeper's careful count, for proposals of marriage in 6 years, 1 from a widower with 3 children, 1 from a railroad clerk who had never seen a calving, and 2 from ranch hands who liked the look of her fence line more than the look of her face. The town had, without ever holding a vote on the matter, agreed she was too independent to marry. It was the kind of thing they said the way people say a mountain is tall. It was simply a fact you did not argue with. Ethan Callaway had ridden into Durango on the 4th of November, on a bay gelding, from a stretch of country 3 days east where he had spent 9 years working other men's herds. He was 36 years old. He was 6'1", weathered brown from the sun, dark hair cut short under a flat-brimmed hat, hazel eyes that were kinder than they had any right to be, a small pale scar along the line of his jaw where a green colt had caught him at 22. He wore a canvas work coat that had been mended twice at the elbows, dark trousers, boots that had walked more miles than most horses. He carried a leather satchel with everything he owned inside it, and $43 in the inside pocket of his coat. He had lost a wife, Mary, and a daughter, Ruth, to a fever in the winter of 1882. He did not speak of them often. He carried them the way a man carries a pocket watch, quietly and against the chest. He had come to Durango because a man he had trusted in Kansas had told him, 2 years back, that the land west of that town was good, and the people were fair, and a hand who did not drink and did not run his mouth could find steady work there. The man in Kansas had died last spring. Ethan had ridden in anyway. Some promises outlive the men who make them. He heard about Clara Bennett within 4 hours of arriving, because in a town of 700 souls a woman like Clara Bennett is heard about within 4 hours. He heard about her at the livery, where the boy currying the horses said she paid cash and asked no favors. He heard about her at the Mercantile, where Mr. Halloran said she was a fine woman and the town's great puzzle. He heard about her at the boarding house, where a widow named Mrs. Fenley said, kindly and with her mouth full of pie, that Clara Bennett was too independent to marry, and that this was a shame, and that if Mr. Callaway was looking for a wife, he would have better luck looking anywhere else in Colorado, or perhaps in Kansas again. Ethan had smiled at Mrs. Fenley, the small, slow smile of a man who had learned in 9 years of working other men's herds that the loudest opinions in a room are almost always the softest thought through. He had said, I appreciate the counsel, ma'am. He had not asked another question about Clara Bennett that day. He had, however, ridden out the 2 miles west the following morning, on his bay gelding, to see about a job. The first time he came up her drive, she was hammering a nail into the corner post of her north fence, in a wind that had teeth. She was not, in that moment, at her most social. She looked up from the post, saw a man on a bay gelding she did not know, and said, without setting down the hammer, if you're here to propose, save your breath and mine. Ethan had touched the brim of his hat. He had said, I'm here about work, ma'am. I heard in town you might be short a hand for the winter push. Clara had considered him for the space of 3 long breaths. She had said, the town told you I was short a hand. The town told me a lot of things, Ethan had said. I'm not much for repeating them. That was the first time she had almost smiled at him. She did not, quite. But her mouth moved, and she set the hammer down on the top rail, and she said, I can pay you $1.40 a day, and room in the bunkhouse, which leaks in the northeast corner. You fix the leak, I'll add a quarter. You start now. He had started then. He had not gone back to the boarding house for his satchel until dusk. By the time he came back the next morning, he had, without being asked, restacked the woodpile on the north side of the barn so the wind would not tear at it, and he had done it in the dark. Clara noticed. She did not remark on it. That was the beginning of it, whether either of them knew it yet or not. November turned. The San Juan Range went from gold to gray to white in the space of a week. Ethan worked. He was, Clara found, the kind of hand who did the second thing before he was asked, and the third thing without ever being told at all. He mended the leak in the bunkhouse in 2 afternoons. He rehung a barn door that had sagged for 2 years on its top hinge. He carried water for her chickens in the mornings when the trough froze, breaking the ice with the flat of an old iron bar, so she would not have to break it herself before her coffee. Clara had done all of these things alone for 6 years. She noticed the not having to do them the way a person notices a headache lifting. Word of the new hand at the Bennett place traveled the way all news traveled in Durango. Slowly at the mercantile, faster at the church steps, fastest at the parsonage kitchen where Mrs. Fenley took her Wednesday tea. By the second week of November, the town had a shape for the thing. The shape was, Clara Bennett had hired a man, which was not new, but this man had stayed past the first Sunday, which was newer. The town had a chorus, and the chorus had names. Mr. Halloran, at the mercantile, said little, but he had begun to weigh out Ethan's coffee and Clara's flour into the same sack when they came in on the same Saturday. And this was the kind of small, deliberate mercy a small-town shopkeeper offers to a thing he wants to see grow. Mrs. Fenley, at the boarding house, said much more. She said, to anyone who would listen, that Mr. Callaway was a fine man, and that Clara Bennett was a fool, and that a woman who did not marry by 34 was a woman who was going to be alone at 74, and that this was a mathematics anyone could do. The Reverend Alcott at the church said nothing at all, but he watched Ethan at the back of the Sunday service and thought, quietly, that here at last was a man he might trust to sit on a pew and not fidget through a sermon. And a young woman named Sarah Doyle, who worked the counter at the mercantile on Saturdays and had known Clara since Clara was 19, told Clara, straight across the counter, that she had eyes and she was not blind, and that whatever Clara was doing with the walking of that hired man past the front window of her house every morning, she ought to do it faster, because winters in Durango were long and life was short and dignity did not keep a person warm at night. Clara had told Sarah Doyle to mind her own counter. She had said it with the corner of her mouth turned up. Sarah had said, in return, I do mind my counter. That is why I see who walks past it. The chorus was not cruel. That was the thing about Durango in 1887. It was not a cruel town. It was only a town that had made up its mind about a woman early, and was now, slowly, being forced to make it up again. Not everyone in the chorus, though, was on the same side. Cyrus Wexley was 41, a well-set widower who had, 3 years back, proposed to Clara Bennett with a bunch of asters in his hand and a decent house and 240 acres to his name. Clara had told him no, kindly, and Cyrus had taken his no like a man, kindly, and had waited. He was still waiting. He was a good man, a fair man. He attended church, paid his hands on time, did not drink to excess, spoke well of the woman who had refused him. When word reached him that a hand from Kansas had been hired at the Bennett place and had not left after the first frost, Cyrus Wexley, being a fair man, rode out one Sunday afternoon to pay Clara a neighborly visit. He wore his best coat. He brought a jar of his housekeeper's plum preserves. He said at her door that he was glad to see her looking well. Ethan was in the barn, splitting a load of pine for the winter. He heard the horse come up the drive. He did not come out. He was not, he had decided long ago, the kind of man who came out of a barn to look at another man on another man's business. He kept splitting. The rhythm of the axe carried across the yard, steady, unhurried, unconcerned. Clara, standing in her doorway with a jar of plum preserves in her hand, heard the rhythm behind her, and she thought, without meaning to, that the sound of that axe was the sound of somebody who was not going anywhere. Cyrus Wexley heard the axe too. He was not a stupid man. He said, "At her door I heard you took on a hand." "I did," Clara said. "Good man?" "Steady," Clara said. "Doesn't talk much." Cyrus had nodded. He had said with a small, tired smile, "Clara, if I'm too late, I'd rather you told me plain than let me keep coming out here with plum preserves." Clara had looked at him for a long moment. She had said, "Cyrus, you're a good man. You'll always be a good man. But I've been a good woman on my own for 6 years, and if I ever change my mind about that, it'll be for reasons I can name out loud." "And can you name them yet?" Cyrus had asked. "Not yet," Clara had said. "But when I can, you'll be the first neighbor I tell." Cyrus had touched the brim of his hat. He had left the plum preserves. He had ridden back down the drive without hurry, which was the kind of dignity a man of 41 has earned, and which is not the same as a man who has been dismissed. That was the last time Cyrus Wexley called on Clara Bennett with a jar of anything. He came later for other reasons as a neighbor, but he came without preserves. Some men can hear a thing the first time it is said. Cyrus Wexley was one of them. December came in on a hard cold. The creek at the west line froze along its edges, then across its middle, then over entirely, and Ethan broke it with an axe every morning so the cattle could drink. He had begun, without asking, to take his supper at Clara's kitchen table 3 nights a week, because Clara had asked him, once in the 2nd week of November, if he was tired of his own cooking. He had said, "Ma'am, I was tired of my own cooking in 1879. Clara had laughed, the first laugh she had laughed at her own table in a long time. He had come to supper the next night. He had come to supper every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday since. She had noticed, one Thursday, that he did not come on the days between, out of a kind of care she had not asked for and had not needed to ask for. Some men understood, without instruction, the difference between welcome and worn out. Ethan Callaway was one of them. They talked at those suppers about the things people talk about at kitchen tables. The weather, the price of cattle, a horse that had thrown a shoe, a hawk seen over the north field. They did not talk, for a long time, about Kansas or about a woman named Mary, or about a girl named Ruth. Clara did not ask. Ethan did not offer. It was the kind of restraint 2 grown people fall into when both of them have carried a grief long enough to know that grief is not a story you tell at supper. It is a country you visit alone. The first time he spoke of them was on a Sunday in early December, over a bowl of stew, when Clara said, without looking up, "You wear a wedding ring you don't wear." Ethan had looked at his left hand. There was a pale band on his ring finger where a ring had been for a long time and was not anymore. He had said, "You have good eyes." "I look at hands," Clara had said. "You can tell a lot about a man from his hands. Yours are the hands of a man who has done work for people he loved." Ethan had set down his spoon. He had said, in the quiet, even voice of a man who has learned to say a hard thing without letting it break him, "Her name was Mary. Our girl was Ruth. Ruth was 4. The winter of '82 took them both inside of a week. The ring is in a tin in my satchel. I took it off the spring after, when I could feel my hand again. I have not put it on. I have not put it away either." Clara had nodded. She had said, 6 years ago last April. My husband, Thomas, kicked in the chest by a mare he'd known for 8 years. He lived 4 hours. We had no children. This place was his father's before his. He asked me at the last to keep it. So I have. That's a long promise to keep alone, Ethan had said. It's the only promise I had left, Clara had said. So I keep it. They had finished the stew. They had not spoken of Kansas or the mare again for a long time. But Ethan had noticed, the next morning, when he came in for his coffee, that Clara had set out 2 cups instead of 1. She had been setting out 2 cups for weeks. He had only, that morning, noticed she had begun to set them slightly closer together. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly sets 2 cups nearer together than they were the week before. In the 2nd week of December, the east-facing window in Clara's kitchen, the window over the wash basin, the one she stood at every morning to watch the light come up over the ridge, cracked in a hard frost. Clara did not remark on it. She stuffed a strip of flannel into the crack against the wind, and she went on. That evening at supper, Ethan said, "That window's finished, Clara. I'll bring glass up from town on Wednesday." She said, "You don't have to." He said, "I know." He rode down to Halloran's on Wednesday. He came back with a pane of glass wrapped in an old blanket, and he took the old window out and he set the new one in, and he did it carefully because glass is a thing that punishes a man in a hurry. When he was done, he stood back and he said more to himself than to her, "There. Now you'll have your light in the morning." Clara had said, from behind him, "Ethan." He had turned. She had said, "Nobody has ever built me a window." He had said, "It was already there. I just kept it there." She had said, "That's the same thing. You just don't know it yet." He had not answered. He had gone back out to split more pine, because a man who does not know what to say with his mouth still has the axe. The axe carried across the yard, steady, unhurried, unconcerned. And Clara had stood at her new paned east-facing window and had watched him swing it, and she had, for the first time in 6 years, 3 months, and about a week, allowed herself to be watched by nobody but the mountains as she cried, quietly, into the flannel of her sleeve. That was the second Wednesday of December. On the third Wednesday of December, Cyrus Wexley came back up the drive, without preserves, with news. The news was this: a land agent from Denver, a man named Harlan Cobb, had been through Durango on the eastbound train that Tuesday, and he had bought paper on 3 parcels along the West Road, and he had made a fair offer in cash on the Bennett place, and he had left the offer with Mr. Halloran to deliver, and he had said, politely and with a good hat in his hand, that he would be back the second Monday of January to hear the answer, and that he hoped, in Clara's best interest, that the answer would be yes, because a single woman running a ranch on the West Line was a thing the country would eventually correct one way or another, and it was better to be corrected by cash than by a hard winter. Cyrus had told her all of this at her kitchen table, with his hat on his knee, because Cyrus Wexley was, above all else, a fair man. He had said, "At the end, Clara, he's not wrong that a hard winter can correct a thing. He is wrong that you're a thing that needs correcting. I thought you should hear it from me before you heard it from Halloran." Clara had thanked him. She had said, "Cyrus, you are a better neighbor than the town deserves." Cyrus had said, "The town does not deserve you either, Clara. That does not seem to have stopped you." He had ridden home. Clara had sat at her kitchen table for a long time after he had gone. Ethan had come in for supper at the usual hour, and he had seen her face, and he had not asked. He had, instead, set the coffee pot on the stove, and he had lit the lamp, and he had waited. Some men know that a woman at her own table with a hard thing in front of her does not need a question. She needs a lit lamp and a warm room. She told him, eventually. He listened. When she was done, he said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want to keep my place." He said, "Then we keep it." She said, "There's no we in the paper, Ethan." He said, "There's a we at this table." That was the first time either of them had said the word out loud. It sat there between them, small and hard and true, like a stone somebody had carried a long way in a pocket. Clara had looked at him for the length of 2 long breaths. She had said, "Ethan Callaway, if you're saying what I think you're saying, you had better say it plain, because I am 34 years old and I am past the age for guessing." Ethan had said, "Plain, Clara. The town said you were too independent to marry. Nobody told me that was a problem. I'd like to marry you, not to save the place. The place is yours. I'd like to marry you because I would like, for the rest of the winters I have, to be the man who breaks the ice on your trough in the morning before you have to." Clara Bennett was 34 years old. She had been asked 4 times in 6 years by 4 different men, and she had said no 4 times, each time cleanly, each time without regret. She said this 5th time in a voice that did not shake, "Yes, Ethan. Yes, I will." They did not kiss then. They were not those kinds of people. They finished the stew. They washed the bowls side by side at the east-facing window. And the second Monday of January was still 10 days away. On the second Monday of January, in the year 1888, Harlan Cobb, the land agent from Denver, came up the drive of the Bennett place on a hired horse, with a leather portfolio under his arm and a good hat in his hand. He was 47 years old, gray at the temples, clean-shaven, well-spoken. He was, as the blueprint of that country's antagonists always was, a reasonable man. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He said, "At Clara's fence line," because Clara had walked out to meet him at the fence line rather than let him into her kitchen. She had learned in 6 years, 3 months, and a hard December, where a woman meets a man who wants a thing from her. He said, "Mrs. Bennett, I've brought the offer up in ink. It is fair. I have paper on the 2 parcels either side of you. I do not want your answer to be difficult. I want it to be easy. Clara had said, Mr. Cobb, I've read your offer. It is fair. That is not the question. What is the question, ma'am? The question is whether a fair offer for a thing that is not for sale is still a fair offer. It is not. Harlan Cobb had, to his credit, considered her for a long moment. He was not a cartoon. He was a man who had been sent up the line by men in Denver who had signed his salary, and he had, in his 47 years, learned that some places you buy and some places you leave. He had said quietly, ma'am, I mean no disrespect. A single woman on a ranch this size on the West Line, in a country that is changing, you know what the mathematics of that are. Ethan Callaway had come up behind Clara at the fence line then. He had not come fast. He had come at the pace of a man who owns the ground he is walking on. He had said, at Clara's shoulder, the mathematics of it, Mr. Cobb, have changed since the last time you did them. Harlan Cobb had looked at Ethan. He had looked at Clara. He had looked at the fence between them, which was a good fence, tight-strung, recently mended, and he had, being a man who knew fences, understood a great deal in one long breath. He had said, I see. I do not think you do, Clara had said. I'll tell you plain, so there's no letter back to Denver about a stubborn woman on the West Line. I am marrying Mr. Callaway on the first Sunday of February. He and I will be running this place together as we have been running it, in effect, since November. The paper on the house will carry both our names by the second Sunday of February. If you come back after that with any offer at all, you will be making it to 2 people, not 1, and the answer will be the same in 2 mouths as it was in 1. I am not, Mr. Cobb, a mathematics problem. I never was. Harlan Cobb had taken that in. He had, to his credit, done a thing most men in his line of work do not do. He had taken off his hat at a fence line in a January wind, and he had said, Mrs. Bennett, I owe you an apology for the phrasing of the offer, if not the offer itself. I will note in my papers that the parcel is not available. I will not be back. He had put his hat back on. He had said, at the last, you had best hope this winter is kind. Mine will be. Yours may not be. Ethan had said, evenly, winters have not been kind here for 6 years, Mr. Cobb. She's still here. Harlan Cobb had almost smiled. He had said, so she is. He had turned his horse. He had ridden down the drive without hurry. He had not, in fact, come back. The chorus of Durango found out about the fence line conversation the way small towns find out about fence line conversations, which is to say, within 4 days in 3 separate versions, each one slightly better than the truth. Mrs. Fenley at the boarding house said Clara Bennett had faced down a Denver man with a shotgun. Mr. Halloran at the Mercantile said Clara Bennett had faced down a Denver man with the truth. Sarah Doyle at the counter said Clara Bennett had faced down a Denver man with a fiancé at her elbow, which was the version closest to correct, and which was also the version that made the Reverend Alcott put his coffee cup down at the parsonage table and say quietly, well, there it is, then. On the first Sunday of February, in the year 1888, Clara Bennett married Ethan Callaway in the front room of the Durango church. It was a small wedding. Sarah Doyle stood up with Clara. Mr. Halloran stood up with Ethan because Ethan did not, yet have a man in Durango he had known long enough to ask, and Mr. Halloran had said, when asked, that he considered it an honor and would be pleased to stand up with any man Clara Bennett had chosen. Cyrus Wexley came to the wedding. He sat in the 3rd row in his best coat, and he clapped when the Reverend Alcott pronounced them, and he shook Ethan's hand at the door afterward with the good handshake of a man who had, over 3 years, learned to lose gracefully, and he said, lo, you'll be good to her. Ethan had said, I will. Cyrus had said, I know it. I would not have shaken your hand otherwise. Mrs. Fenley cried at the wedding. She cried the loud, unbothered cry of a woman who has publicly been wrong about a mathematics problem, and who is privately relieved to have been. She told everyone within reach that she had always thought Clara Bennett would come around. Nobody corrected her. That is the kindness a small town owes the loudest voice in its chorus. On a good day. Durango that Sunday was having a good day. They rode back up the drive to the Bennett place, the Bennett Callaway place now, though it would take the town another 6 months to remember to say it, in the wagon side by side in a February sun that was the color of a coin. Clara wore the same blue wool dress. She had added, that morning, her mother's small silver locket outside the collar, so it would show. Ethan wore the canvas work coat, mended a third time at the elbows by Clara herself, in the last week of January, while he was out breaking the ice on the trough. Spring came the way it always comes in that country. Slow at first, then all at once. The creek broke free. The cottonwoods along the west line went gold green, then green. The cattle dropped calves. Ethan built, in the second week of April, a new gate for the west pasture, because the old gate had never hung right, and because a man who has waited a long time to build a gate for a place he intends to stay does not put it off past the first thaw. Clara helped him hang it. They hung it together at the fence line, in an April light that came in low across the ridge. When it was done, Clara had put her hand on the top rail of the gate, and she had said, "You built this to last." Ethan had said, "I built it to last as long as we do." She had said, "That is the same thing." He had said, "I know it." That evening, they had supper at the kitchen table, at the east-facing window, in 2 cups set close together. In the last of a light Ethan had built her a window to see. And Clara, without meaning to, had said out loud, half to him and half to the room, "The town said I was too independent to marry." Nobody told you that was a problem. Ethan had smiled the small, slow smile of a man who has been repeated back to himself, and he had said, "It never was, Clara. It was the best thing about you. It still is. Grief in that country does not leave. It just learns to share the house with other things." Ethan kept the tin with Mary's ring in it on the top shelf of the bureau, where Clara could see it, and where Clara sometimes, on a hard evening, touched it with 2 fingers on her way past. The way one touches a door to a room one is not going into tonight. Clara kept Thomas's Bible on the parlor table. Ethan read it sometimes on Sunday afternoons. Some houses are big enough to hold more than one love, if the people in them are willing to make the room. Clara and Ethan made the room. And so listen, you who have been told, by a town or by a well-meaning voice at a boarding house table or by the arithmetic of your own hard years, that you are too much of something to be loved, too independent, too tired, too particular, too late. Listen, the town is not always right about the mathematics. Sometimes the mathematics change because a stranger rides up a drive on a bay gelding, in a wind that has teeth, and he does not repeat what the town has told him. Sometimes the mathematics change because you set 2 cups on a table 1 week slightly closer together than they were the week before. Love, in the country that raised these stories, does not announce itself. It builds a window so you will have your light in the morning. It breaks the ice on the trough before you have to. It stands at a fence line when a man in a good hat has come to buy you out, and it says the mathematics have changed. Thank you, friend, for riding this stretch of road with me. Thank you for sitting at this kitchen table, for standing at this fence line, for hearing this story out to its end. Until next time, keep riding. If this story warmed the room for you tonight, ride on with us to the next one. A widower in the San Juan foothills who thought he had nothing left to offer, and the schoolteacher who, one Saturday in October, quietly proved him wrong at the front gate of a house he had almost given up on. Her name was Hannah Reed. His was Isaac Vance. Their story is waiting on the trail just ahead. Until next time, keep riding.